Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cracking Addiction. My name is Dr. Ferghal Armstrong, and we have a very special guest on today. We have Mr. Thomas Conrad. Welcome, Tom. Can we just very quickly go through what you do and why you do it, and then we'll get into the meat and bones of what we're going to talk about today.
Sure, yeah. Well, first off, appreciate you having me on. I'm in recovery almost 14 years now, and it dates back to 2010. I can spare you all the details, but alcohol was really my the love of my life, and I really mean that. At 26 years old, I found myself drinking every single day. I was an auto mechanic by trade. And the last 3 weeks of my drinking, I managed to total my car, get a DUI, and get fired from my job. Lo and behold,
was your rock bottom.
Yeah. Yep. Lo and behold, I found myself, and I grew up in Pittsburgh area, Pennsylvania, and took a one-way flight to Jacksonville, Florida, where I went to detox residential treatment. And I was there for 45 days and then transitioned to West Palm Beach, where I currently am, and did like an intensive outpatient program in West Palm Beach for, probably the next 3 months, coupled with sober living the whole entire time, and stayed in sober living through a year of sobriety. And got my first job in addiction treatment at a year sober, and here I am today.
So here you are today, and you run a podcast called the Real Recovery Podcast. And so you also work in addiction treatment. Is that right?
Yeah. So the podcast is called Real Recovery Talk.
Recovery Talk.
Yep. And the treatment center is Rock Recovery Center. The podcast. Do you want me to go into details on either of those yet, or no?
I'm curious. Why not? Let's just so we understand that. I want the listeners to understand the depth of your experience and also your expertise when we're talking about what recovery is.
Yeah. So, like I said, looking back on it, when I got my first job in treatment at a year sober, I was a behavioral health tech. Basically, what that is, it's a fancy word for a babysitter. I kept eyes on all the clients and made sure that they were attending all their groups and going to their individual therapy sessions, making sure they get to their doctor's appointments, so on and so forth. And, coming from being an auto mechanic, I knew I didn't want to go back into that field because I hated it, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And so I knew I was going to go more into the addiction route. And, so I've worked in addiction for, like I said, 13 years now. And, in 2014, had an opportunity to open up, a center, and it's called Rock Recovery Center. And we're in West Palm Beach, Florida. We've been open now 10 years. And it was me and my co-host of Real Recovery Talk, Ben Bueno. Him and I were literally the same exact age. We were both born April 7th, 1984. We met in sobriety, and, we always knew that we had something to offer this space. And so we opened up Rock Recovery Center, and, so the treatment center in and of itself has been operating for 10 years now. And, it's great. We're a small program. We only treat about 25 people at a time. We keep our clients, anywhere from 3 to 5 months on average. And, we provide them with the sober living and stuff like that. Now, in terms of Real Recovery Talk, that's a completely separate entity. And the reason for Real Recovery Talk podcast was to really kind of hone in on families and loved ones, because oftentimes people when you enter into the treatment space, all the clinicians, all the behavioral health techs, the doctors, the administrative staff, everybody focuses on the addict themselves. Rightfully so. You're in a treatment center. That's their job. That's what they're there to do. And the families are left to figure it out. You know, hey, we're gonna treat the addict. We're gonna treat your loved one. Everything's gonna be okay here, and don't worry, you'll kind of figure this out as time goes on. And I had always wanted to start a podcast. I had no clue how to start a podcast, and one day my good friend of mine said, "Just plug a microphone into a computer and start talking." And that's what I did. That was back in 2017. And, fast forward to today, I just released, I have 398 episodes, in a lot of the jails and a lot of prison systems here in the United States, and, have a pretty good reach in terms of the podcast. And the coolest thing about it is that families and loved ones tune in all the time to get perspective from us and, to understand more about addiction and the things they can do, the things they shouldn't do. Just an overarching, understanding of addiction from the families and the loved ones' perspective. And then we also have Dr. Tambini as well. She's another host. So it's myself, Ben, and Dr. Tambini. She's an addictionologist. So we kind of have, all the areas covered. And then I pull in my primary therapists from Rock Recovery Center, who are licensed clinicians. Anytime we want to discuss, like we just did an episode yesterday on depression, and I'm not qualified. I mean, I can talk from my own experience and stuff like that, but I have the ability to pull in a clinician, a licensed clinician, to discuss that, coupled with Dr. Tambini. She can discuss the medical side of it. So it's really geared towards families and loved ones, but we do have a lot of addicts, a lot of alcoholics that listen, just because, we keep it fun too and lighthearted. So I love it.
So you've got a vast wealth of experience and knowledge and around recovery, and you're basically providing that knowledge you're helping others. So I just wanted to go back a couple of steps, because you've said a lot in there, and I think we need to unpack that. First of all, you said that you hated being an auto mechanic. Now, I know I've met a lot of patients who have had dramatic changes in their careers pre the moment of early recovery to after that early recovery. Like a regular guest on my podcast used to work in the construction industry, and he said he hated it. Now he works in the recovery space and he loves it. What was going on there? Why did you hate the auto industry?
Well, I mean, it was something that was really not forced on me, but highly encouraged. I grew up with my dad. My mom was absent from my life, and my dad was an auto mechanic. We grew up in backwoods Pennsylvania. I say Pittsburgh because nobody really knows where I'm from. A small town in Pennsylvania, very blue collar. It was, very, that was the type of work that you did. You were either involved in the construction industry in some capacity, whether a bricklayer or electrician, plumber, something along iron worker, or you worked on cars, and, my dad being who he is and who he grew up working on cars. And so I was always in that environment, in the garage, wrenching on cars from a very young age. And, it was just it was the opportunity that was given to me. I worked at a car dealership. They paid for my school. Even though looking back on it, the school in and of itself taught me nothing. You still had to go through it. And so
Yeah.
I ended up working on the cars, and, but I didn't enjoy it because I don't know. I just didn't like busting my knuckles all day and, getting splashing hot oil on me or whatever the case, and being dirty and smelly, and, and coupled with working next to my dad all day. I mean, that just, it was a recipe for disaster. And my escape was, going to the bar after work. That's what I did. I would finish
Right.
working on cars and go to the bar and, talk about how miserable my day was.
So there was a lot of unhappiness that was driving your underlying substance use, alcohol use, and when you hit your rock bottom, that's when you realize something had to change. And looking at you now, you've got such wisdom. So I want to ask you this then: how do you bottle your recovery? What are the key ingredients?
So, on my show, any of the listeners will tell you I'm big on community.
Yeah.
One of the main ingredients for me, and especially in the beginning, was surrounding myself with good people. Um, because I didn't really know that there was a life to be had outside of drinking and drugging. I really
Yeah.
didn't. I thought that that's what everybody did. And to be honest, where I grew up, that kind of is what everybody did. And, so when I ended up in Florida, I quickly realized, okay, I have an opportunity here to kind of rebuild myself. And one of the things that I had to make the conscious effort of doing was surrounding myself with people that have done the things that I'm about to do, and just
Mm.
surround myself with good people. So the community aspect, I think, in the beginning and even still to this day, is extremely important. I love meeting new people. I love, having conversations with people that I don't know.
Mm.
Just networking in general. Every
Yeah.
opportunity that's been afforded to me up to this point has been a result of meeting new people and community and stuff like that. You know,
So
good.
community for me is absolutely vital. But it's not the entire story. What
Right.
about meaningful activity? You know, you changed. You hated being an a mechanic. Do you like what you do now?
Yeah, I mean, what I do now, I hardly even consider work. I'm
Yeah.
very blessed in the sense that I get to come into work every day and do what I love. I mean, what we're doing right now is practically what I do on a daily basis, and just make sure the treatment center in and of itself is running, and I have an open door policy. So our therapists, come in and run stuff by me, and,
Yeah.
operations staff, same thing,
Yeah.
but I love it because I can see, the impact that we're having and stuff like that. I mean, it's very fruitful. I wouldn't change it. No, I love what I do.
So you find meaning and value in what you do by helping people, and you've got this sober community that you are enriched with. How do you communicate the need for that to someone who's pre-contemplative, thinking, they're sitting? Just imagine someone sitting in a bar, just like you were, talking to the barman about how awful their life was. What would you say to that man? How would you help that man across the threshold to your service and then to his own beautiful recovery?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, I'm a firm believer that there's only so much I can do. I believe in sharing my experience. I believe in, just having open conversation with somebody, actually listening, active listening, I think is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but primarily just sharing with somebody like, look, I was at where you were or where you are today. And,
Yeah.
I got through it, and just listening to them and hearing what they have to say. I tell people all the time, we're all of our situations are unique. Our life circumstances are different, so on and so forth, but we're pretty much
Mm.
all cut from the same cloth. I mean, we're using drugs, we're using alcohol in the same ways,
Mm.
but we're trying to achieve the same end result, which is basically just not feel. I want to feel
Not feel
something
pain.
different.
Yeah. Yeah. Be
Yeah, I
numb.
don't want to feel the pain anymore. Yeah.
Yeah. But that word uniqueness really reminds me of the many patients who I see who are contemplative, pre-contemplative, and they use their uniqueness as a barrier to services, and so they'll say things to me like, "Oh, look, this group, it's not for me. They're not like me. I'm not like them. I'm not as bad as them. I have a job. I have a car." And that's challenging for me to get over that. When I encounter uniqueness as a barrier, it's difficult for me. What would you say to that?
I just did an episode on this a couple weeks ago on functional alcoholism.
Yeah.
And I think it's very hard to reason with somebody that's a functional alcoholic because they have everything. They still have the job. They still have maybe the wife and the kids, or the husband and the kids, or they still have the boyfriend and the girlfriend, or, all the materialistic things. And,
Mm.
it's very, very difficult. Somebody, in my opinion, that's in pre-contemplation stage, I find that there's not much in the way that we can, move them from pre-contemplation to contemplation from a humanistic standpoint, like conversation.
Mm.
Very hard for me to get through to somebody. I need something to happen to them, some sort of consequence in some capacity. Doesn't need to be something uh, major. Hopefully it can be. I look at my own
Mm.
situation, and it took a DUI. It took a DUI. It took, getting fired from my job. In the grand scheme of things, those are not that big of consequences, but it was enough to get me to make a change. There were plenty of negative consequences before that. Don't get me wrong. I had the health
Mm.
consequences and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
I continued to drink despite negative consequences. And there was no person in my life that could change my mind. It was something that I had to come to terms with. And fortunately, looking back on it, I still lived with my dad. I mean, he was paying my bills. He was doing this. And finally, he pulled the rug out from underneath me. And I was kind of forced into this process. So,
So was
you
it
know,
was it the DUI? Was it the job loss? Or was the father kicking you out of home? Was that which one of those was the act's absolute rock bottom that I have to change?
well, I distinctly remember when I got my DUI, it was a kid from high school. I went to high school with this guy, and he was the one that gave me my DUI.
He was a
And,
cop, was he?
huh?
He was a cop.
Yeah. Yep. He was the police
So
officer on duty, and he pulled me over and gave me my DUI. But I distinctly remember sitting in the back of the cop car in handcuffs and just having this like sigh of relief, because I knew that the end was near. I knew that, like, okay, I'm not going to have to do this much longer, because honestly, at that point, it was a full-time job on top of my actual full-time job.
yeah.
But I got my DUI, and the next day I was drinking. And then the day after that, I was drinking. And the day after that, I was drinking. And then a couple days after that is when I got fired from my job, and my dad was really the one that fired me. And then,
So your
you
father
know,
fired you.
yeah, he called me and said, not only do you not have a job, but you also don't have a place to live anymore. And then he followed it up by saying, I spoke to this place in Florida. It's a treatment center and you can go there. And I'm like, what? Okay. And 3 hours later, I was on a flight to Jacksonville. Yeah.
You must have been frightened as hell. There is a fear, isn't it, when you got to that point when you've hit rock bottom and you want help. What's the next step? I mean, it must have been very, very frightening for you. You're very brave. I think everyone who first approaches a treatment program is incredibly brave.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that I didn't have any options, so I had to kind of, as Sean Cannell says, a guy that I follow, he says, you got to punch fear in the face. And, that's essentially what I had to do. I remember standing at Pittsburgh International Airport at 26 years old, crying like a baby because I was about to get on an airplane. And I had flown like once before that. And I was a child, like I didn't even remember it. So it was really my first time flying, going to a state that I had never been to before, going into a treatment center, and I thought it was going to be like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I was going to be in straight jacket and, all the things. So, but lo and behold, it was nothing like that. And, that was really a pivotal moment for me. But yeah, it was scary as hell.
Yeah. Yeah. I congratulate everyone that comes to my care on A, surviving to the point where they can come to my care, and then B, to actually getting here.
Yeah.
It's a big step. Now, when you first started talking about your program, you mentioned the need to reach out to friends and family and loved ones. Let's talk a little bit about that. It's not just the patient.
Yeah, well, families and loved ones, a lot of them don't understand the role that they play. Oftentimes, especially in dysfunctional families, which every family is dysfunctional on some level. And if you don't think that you are, then
you're
more dysfunctional than, yeah. It's pretty interesting that a lot of times friends and families, loved ones, they want to point the finger. Well, if Tom would just stop doing this, if Tom would just stop doing that, can't Tom see the destruction that he's causing in our lives, and so on and so forth. And it's like, well, wait a second.
It's not just that, is it? It's not just that. You get families that actually enable and facilitate ongoing substance use or alcohol use.
Well, yeah, I think that, that's oftentimes parents and loved ones are harder to deal with than the addict themselves. I can't tell you how many conversations I have with moms and dads that they're incapable of drawing a boundary. And if they do draw a boundary, they're incapable of holding the boundary. So they play a pivotal role in somebody's recovery. And sometimes it sucks. Sometimes it hurts. I have conversations with moms and for whatever reason, moms, it hurts the most, which I get. Mama bear always wants to protect her cubs, but sometimes you have to
let go.
Well, you got to let go, and a lot of times they're not capable of doing so. And I tell them all the time.
There's a mother that I know about who's the mother of a patient of mine, and she said this piece of wisdom to me, which I think is fabulous. She's a devout Catholic. She's the mother of I think 7 children, but her youngest son has got problems, which I won't go into.
Mm-hmm.
And her priest told her, and she told me, that the priest said, unless you let go, you don't create the space in which Christ and God can start working for your son's recovery. So you got to let go to give space for God to work in. I think that's, for those of a religious bent, I think that's very profound.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I'm a Christian myself, and I think that, that makes all the sense in the world, because at some point in time, um, even if you look at an addict or and I grew up a Christian, so
Yeah.
it was, I knew God was there, but I pulled God off the mantle whenever I needed God.
Yes.
And, when now, and it's interesting that you say that, because if I think about this, my dad doing what he created enough space for me to actually need to rely on God. Before, I didn't need to. All I needed to do was rely on myself and rely on my dad and
Yeah.
his pocketbook.
But that
But
goes to the that goes to the first step in the 12-step program. We admit to
yeah,
ourselves and others that our lives have become we're powerless over alcohol, and our
yeah,
lives are being unmanageable.
yeah,
That admission allows the space in which to then acknowledge the second step, which is the higher power.
yeah, yeah. And this is an interesting topic, especially for people that don't have any concept of a higher power. Um,
Mm.
but the way I portray it to people is, look, I'm not asking you to go to the closest church and, start tithing and get baptized and give your life to Christ. I'm not asking you to do that. What I'm asking you to do is just understand that you're not God, and that there is
I like
something
that.
out there. There's
Yes.
something out there that is greater than you. And if you, in fact, don't even believe that there's a higher power of any sorts, then sure, if you want to use the rooms and you want to use the people inside the rooms, you can. Because I firmly believe that, over the course of time, people do tend to come up with their own, conception of a higher power. And I like the way that Russell Brand puts it the most. I mean, Russell Brand and his rendition of the 12 steps, I think, is great.
Yeah.
It's not PG. And for any of your listeners, if you haven't, do a quick Google search of Russell Brand 12 steps, and
Yeah.
it's pretty fascinating. The way that he rewords it, it's the same. And Russell Brand is a big 12 step guy, and he's actually a new Christian. Um, but I'll go to that because it 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 kind of removes the higher power aspect of it,
Yeah.
but it
Yeah.
doesn't, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. So let's go back to mom. It's not just about letting go. The mom has to accept the possibility that their child might die and there's nothing they can do about it. That's a difficult lesson to
Mm-hmm.
learn. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, my co-host Ben Bueno, he has a good phrase. He says, "I'd rather step on your toes than step on your grave." Um,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
a
I'm
lot of
so used to
times
that
with
one. That's great.
Yeah, a lot of times with moms, sometimes you have to do things that hurt. Sometimes you have to say things that are, less than ideal. Sometimes you have to draw boundaries that you don't want to draw, but you have to understand that it's for the greater good. And I tell them all the time, you love them from afar and you kill them up close. You keep doing what you're doing.
Well, that's another great
You're,
line.
yep, you're bound to find them overdosed. And, in this day and age, I don't know how fentanyl is over there, but over here, it's crazy. I mean, you can't even go out and smoke weed anymore without worrying if it's laced with fentanyl. It's very unfortunate, but that's just the world that we live in today. And, moms got to be able, and dads, they got to be able to let go. That's just the bottom line.
What boundaries should moms and dads put in place?
I think it depends on where we're at. Because I've seen situations where moms and dads, you know, find out that their young adult child is smoking weed and then send them to Florida for treatment. And now they're in Florida and they figure out they now they're surrounded with IV heroin users or IV fentanyl users,
Yeah.
and they learn more about drugs than they had ever known before. Um, So I really think that it depends on where they're at in their addiction as to how hard of boundaries that you need to set. If this is something that is new, relatively new, maybe they're drinking on the weekends and smoking a little bit of weed, I'm not going to say put them on an airplane and send them off to treatment somewhere, because I don't think we're there yet. But if it's somebody that is continuing to use despite negative consequences, you know, now the boundaries need to tighten up a little bit.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
it could be, hey, like what my dad did with me. You're no longer employed and you no longer have a place to live. If you want to go kick it on the streets, you're more than welcome. Or you
Mm.
can go to sunny South Florida and get your act together.
But it's not just about that. We've also got to think from a parental perspective. We've got to think about the one pill kill. You mentioned fentanyl, but this, the nitazines are coming up. The further derivatives of fentanyl are there. You take one pill laced with fentanyl or anything else like that, you're dead. Um, So how do we communicate to kids, or how do we help parents communicate to kids that literally one experimental pill and you will not wake up?
Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for this, and I don't. And I honestly, I wish I did, because I have three kids myself. I have an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And, so I can only tell you what I do. I don't shy away from these topics at all around my kids. My kids, obviously, in their mind, I'm like a world renowned podcaster for whatever reason. They look at me as a celebrity, which is cool in and of itself. But, they hear my conversations that I have with people. They, when I'm in the car, I listen to the podcast. I listen to my own podcast a lot of times to see what improvements I can make and stuff like that. Um, I don't make it taboo, and I never want to make it taboo. I want them to have an understanding of, what this stuff is and what it can do to people.
Yeah.
I don't raise my kids with an iron fist and, say you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. Like, hey, if you want to climb 15 foot up in the tree and get stuck in it, that's fine. Figure out how to get down, and if I need to, I'll bust out the ladder and help you get down.
Mm.
Um, that's my philosophy. I think that
Yeah.
the more you try and shield somebody from this stuff, from a young age, the more detrimental it can be. But I would be curious to hear from a professional standpoint, maybe from a child psychologist or something along those lines, what they would say. Because
Mm.
honestly, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, neither do I. But I like what you're saying about this concept of controlled risk exposure. Again, I'm not a child psychologist, but I really do feel that if you try and mollycoddle and protect children from the rest of the world, when those training wheels fall off, as inevitably they will, they're just not prepared for the world. So, and that's the most dangerous time. If you've got some naive 22-year-old who's just finds himself in the world, mom and dad aren't there, that's a scary time. And I think that's when bad decisions get made, and I think that's when problems start, more so than a kid who's street smart from the age of 10 or 11 because his parents have helped him become that way.
Yeah, well, I look at my own situation. My mom left when I was 2 years old. So, I want to obviously speak to any single parents out there. Like, it's tough, and you can't control everything. My dad did as best he could with the resources that he had. And, he still had to work. He had to put food on the table. But at a very young age, I was independent. And with that independence came experimentation and, going out into the woods and smoking hollow sticks at, 12 years old. If it burned, I was smoking it. Um, it's just who I was, and can I place blame on my dad for that? No. Um, but he was a single parent. Like, so I do think there's something to be said about single parent households versus, children that are raised with a mother and a father, I'm happily married, and I'll tell you, it's one of the, I see client, with Rock Recovery Center, the treatment center here, I could tell you there's a vast difference with people that have parents that are still together and, raise their children. There's a very distinct difference in the personality from those people to the people that, didn't really have parents or were absent parents or they were divorced at a young age or whatever the case is, So it's an interesting topic. I mean, I could go on for hours on it probably.
Sadly, we've run out of time, Tom. I want to say it's been absolutely fascinating chatting with you, and I want to thank you for giving us your time and your wisdom today. Thank you.
Absolutely. No problem. Anytime.
That's all for today, folks. My name is Dr. Ferghal Armstrong, and this has been Cracking Addiction.